Welcome to In the Author Studio. I'm very excited about our episode today. Normally do we have somebody that's called the father of something, and we do have the father of open innovation on our webcast today. A bit about what we're trying to do here within the Author Studio. We are a webcast and a podcast with a little bit of a different bent. We explore in depth with discussions with authors and change agents around the world that are doing great and wondrous things in the worlds of innovation and transformation and change and growth and mapping out new futures. I'm honored today to have one Henry Chesbrough. I know you've been doing thought leadership in the innovation space for the last 2 decades, and it's just really nice to have you on here today, Henry.
Well, Sean, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I'll give a little bit of and I think your reputation precedes you, but I'll give a little bit of a bio in terms of Henry's background. And I think we've got a bit of a double-barreled approach today. I wanted to pay respect to the first book that you had written, Open Innovation, but you have new stuff. And they always say when you meet important, famous people like yourself, they always want to talk about the new stuff. So we are going to talk about where your formative work has pivoted to today. I guess, colloquially have been called the father of open innovation. You're the faculty director of the Garwood Center for Corporate Innovation at UC Berkeley Haas. You've written, I've now established this right, you've written 7 books over the last 2 decades, all in relation to open innovation. You've won a number of awards from either the European Commission or there are types of awards I didn't even know existed. The Industrial Research Institute, there's a long list of awards. You're also part of the Thinkers 50, which usually carries with it the reputation of this person's really informed on their subject. So have I missed anything pertinent out of your bio that I should have added, Henry?
The only thing I would add, Sean, is that I actually worked in industry for a number of years before I went back and got a PhD and became an academic. So in my work, I actually actively try to write both for my academic peers, but also my industry colleagues as well.
I have an immense amount of respect for that. Sometimes, as much as I love the academic trips that I can go down, most of my life is living in the corporate world, where I do appreciate somebody that can bring the pragmatics into it too. And it sounds like we're going to have a bit of that discussion today. As well, I've kind of, I guess in looking at your bio, you started out as a marketer. You were a corporate marketeer at some point in time, right? So
yeah, I joined a startup company in the hard disk drive industry back in 1983, a company called Quantum. And at that time, there were more than 100 hard disk drive manufacturers in business around the world. And the startup did well, it took off. But today, there's been tremendous consolidation, and there are only 2 companies in the whole world that today are making hard disk drives.
It's crazy, right? And that's, I mean, we're talking, just a little bit over 2 decades. So
that's right. Yeah.
I think the acceleration is actually happening even faster. So this is a book I bought with my own money. So it's always testament when it's your own money. It's not something given to you. I think I was probably toiling away in some corporate universe back then and trying to look at how the world out there was seeing the world differently. And whereas we talk about open innovation so freely now, this was groundbreaking at the time. You've coined this term, and I think at the time it was the elemental stages of this. We were now 2 decades further. I know somebody was interviewing Tom Peters once about In Search of Excellence and talked about 2 decades later, In Search of Excellence, Tom, what do you think about your conclusions then? And he had picked some companies that didn't necessarily work out so well, but I think the guidelines of his book are just as interesting today as they were then. In your case, you wrote this in, I think, 2003. What's your retrospective on it? How does it stand up to the test of time? And are there things that you would have written differently maybe if you had gone back?
So let's see. To me, it has stood up very well. The evidence in the book was built on research I did mostly in Silicon Valley and mostly in the tech industry. So there are chapters on IBM and Intel and Lucent and a couple of the pharmaceutical companies. And I was very proud of the book at the time, but it was only after the book was published and word began to get around that I learned that the things I was seeing are also happening in the chemicals industry or the fast-moving consumer goods industry or many other parts of the economy that I had not studied. And that's when it really got exciting, was that some of the same ideas that I had studied in one context actually seemed to be insightful in contexts that I knew nothing about. And so today I would say that there's more interest in open innovation in Europe than there is in the US. And so even though the book was written while I was in the US and the companies in the book are all from the US, today the center of gravity is international, particularly in Europe. I'm seeing growing interest in places like Japan and China as well.
It's interesting, and I'll turn toward today. I know you've just launched a book at the turn of the year, and unfortunately, pandemic happens. All of a sudden, there's probably been some foils in everybody's plans in terms of the move forward. But you've produced a book with an intriguing title, Open Innovation Results, and I do love the emphasis on results. Is this the real unfettered kind of view of the world and how to actually deliver stuff behind open innovation, Henry?
So it is a book I could only have written after many years of interacting with people trying to make open innovation work and trying to get results. And what I've learned in that process is it isn't simply a checklist of do this, 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 and this, and aha, you're destined for innovation success. It's really hard work, and it really involves a lot of organizational change to make it work. And that's probably something I underestimated when I wrote the first book, is just how hard it is to get the whole organization to change itself to be able to do this.
And it's interesting. I'll probably contextualize our interview today. Right now, we're probably at the fourth week, maybe depending on where you are in terms of lockdown around this pandemic. And I've been asking all my guests this week just how people are faring, but also in light of the work that you've just produced, do you have thoughts or comments in terms of how this plays within kind of this state of economic and health and really societal paranoia and health scares that we're going through right now?
I think the book plays pretty well. One of the core arguments is building an innovation infrastructure. And with public health in the pandemic, we clearly could and should have built a stronger infrastructure, whether it's inventories of masks and ventilators or early warning systems and agreed protocols that we would follow when certain early warning indicators were triggered. The reason there's a triangle on the cover of the new book is that we have to have not only generation of new ideas, but we also have to have broad dissemination and absorption. And so as we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really important that we not simply get little flowers blooming in one corner or another, but that we find the things that work and we get them everywhere in the society. And we really have this deep interdependency amongst us all. And so I think this emphasis on generating, disseminating, and absorbing to get it across the whole society actually works pretty well.
I love it. We're going to talk about that certainly in the back half of our interview today, Henry, just kind of what's in the book. I wanted to level set for everybody here because, you go back 2 years, almost 20 years now, I guess. This was one of the frameworks, I believe, lifted straight from your book. Obviously, the graphics are probably a little bit more 2003 than 2020. But for the people that might not be as familiar with open innovation, just take people through the ground strokes of what you were trying to say there.
So the actual definition of open innovation is about a distributed innovation process with purposive flows of knowledge across organizational boundaries for both monetary and non-monetary purposes. So it's really about knowledge flows across organizations. But what really has stuck with it is these visualizations like the one you have here, where we often visualize innovation as a funnel from research on one end and the market on the other end, and the journey from the laboratory to the marketplace. And what you see in this visual is, instead of a solid wall for a funnel, which is very rigid, we have this dotted line or a semi-permeable membrane where things flow in and out of the organization on the journey from the lab to the market. And so the two main flows are from the outside going into your own innovation process, and the second flow is from the inside going out for others to use in their businesses.
You know what, and I probably have it clearer in my mind now than I did then when I read it. I think I was probably processing in real time, but now that I've had a chance to look back at it, you're really getting at some things around innovation by configuration or business modeling. And I know we've had a decade of people that have come, whether it's Osterwalder or a number of people that have taken some business model stuff and taken it a few steps further. Really, the classic world of, you've got an R&D department that produces your own internal innovation, and it goes through some technological criteria and eventually gets commercialized by a whole bunch of other people. Really, in your model, gets put under a lot of scrutiny and changes, doesn't it?
That's correct. I know you had Tendaya Vicky in one of your recent programs, and he's done some great work in large companies of how do you nurture these new businesses and get them to go out. There are lots of sources of inertia, and even the business model itself in most large successful companies is both a focusing device that attracts things that fit with it, but it's also myopic in that it causes large organizations to filter out information and possibilities that don't align with the predominant business model. So there's a dominant logic of a business model in many large companies for a good reason, because that's how the company became large and successful. And so the organization is really scaled around that, but in the process is less adaptive and less flexible than it was before the large business model became so successful.
You are a prisoner of your own success, right? No.
Indeed, yes.
All right. And the only other thing I wanted to expose from that early book was you had a set of different principles, almost, I don't know if you said it so passionately that it was a manifesto, but certainly there's a distinct difference between somebody operating in a closed versus an open world. We don't necessarily have to go through all the principles here, but is there one that you particularly think about more in light of 2020 that you go, wow, we should have more of that, or wow, if you look at the companies that are doing work, they really have adopted this principle to heart?
So it's kind of on the middle, on the right-hand side, where we have the statement, building a better business model is better than getting to market first. Whether it's SoftBank or the Vision Fund, there are a lot of people out there investing on the idea of getting to scale as quickly as possible, this idea of Blitzscaling. And I think what sometimes is missed is it isn't just about the idea or the market or the technology, but finding the right business model is so important. And so it was there from the beginning, but it's something that now I think it's in, with the benefit of the hindsight of 17 years, it's a really important insight that, as you say, many others have taken us much further since then.
I was going to bring up Blitzscaling actually, because I think if anything, one of the things that carries throughout all of your 7 books and all of your work is this embrace of collaboration and openness. And you obviously work in California. You see the bright lights of Silicon Valley and just trying to hatch things to the world quick and fast and global and winner takes all. Is the whole notion of Blitzscaling almost paradoxical to good open innovation? Like, is the winner take all approach to Blitzscaling challenging in terms of a promotion of open innovation? Because the people that you're trying to collaborate with might be scared to no end in terms of your market share being taken away by the person you're trying to partner with.
It's a great question, Sean. And is I've reflected on it, and I know some of the authors of that book and that concept, and I've got good respect for them, but I think they are advising companies to find ways to scale quickly, to preserve and hopefully strengthen your culture so that as you scale, you don't lose your focus, you don't get a bunch of inferior people that pull you away from the potential you could achieve. All of that sounds really good. What I worry about, which is implied in your question, is that you also become highly inflexible when you do that. You kind of develop this herd mentality, this group think, and this dominant logic we were talking about a moment ago that works really well with that business model. And as long as the world stays more or less the same, that's fine. But if and when the world starts to change, like it is right now,
Yeah.
the companies that have blitzscaled 6 months or a year ago might be completely inflexible in this moment. And so I think there's a genuine trade-off between exploration and exploitation. And the blitzscaling is all on the exploitation side, and I think doesn't give enough attention to the exploration side.
I think that's a really good bridge point, and certainly brings us to kind of today. I saw an article that somebody written about, and I'm not too sure if it's in your new book, but you had coined the term "fear of looking foolish." We've talked about
Yes.
FOMO, fear of missing out. I think it's I don't know if it's probably a good acronym. FOLF. I think it rolls off my tongue. Is the people human side of doing open innovation what's holding us back? Like it's just all of our human frailties of looking silly, partnering with people we don't necessarily know, perhaps even strangers. Is this what's holding a lot of companies back from embracing some of the principles you talked about here?
Yes, in a word.
Okay.
I would say that compared to 17 years ago, I genuinely thought that if I could lay out the things that I was observing and give clear, detailed examples of what these companies are doing and how they're doing it, that it would be a fairly straightforward matter for companies to adopt this and use it. And that I've learned now is really quite simplistic because people are complicated and organizations of people even more so. So we talked about knowledge flows across organizational boundaries. What we didn't talk about is barriers to knowledge flows within companies. And particularly in larger companies, there are a lot of things where people hoard their knowledge and don't share it with other parts of the company. And these internal silos can themselves become huge barriers to innovation. And this is something I wasn't giving nearly enough thought to 17 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting whether it's technology or innovation. I mean, it really does come down to people sometimes in terms of what's going to make something work or not. People, and I guess groups of people laddering to culture. So I wanted to
Sean,
expose.
before we leave the people, let me put one more fact on the table.
Sure.
If you go to LinkedIn, and I did this 2 weeks ago, but everyone in your audience can do it right now if they want. If you use open innovation as a term in quotation marks as a search term on LinkedIn, you can search on people or jobs and see what results you get. When I did it 2 weeks ago, I got 58,000 people on LinkedIn who had open innovation in their job description. And there were more than 4,000 jobs available for people working in open innovation. So it really has become an area of business practice. And there are people who have job titles like Manager of Open Innovation, or my favorite, Vice President of Open Innovation.
Yeah, and I guess I'll lend some further support to your point. We just did a study on the skills of a future-proof leader of tomorrow, and the number one skill of about 40 we looked at was adaptive intelligence, which implied within it is you're looking at a whole bunch of sources and bringing a whole bunch of them to bear on whatever issue or problem or opportunity you're trying to build. So I'm nodding my head to you, Henry. I know in your new book, and I saw a video promoting it, I believe, there's you illustrate a very interesting paradox that I'm not too sure as many people are mining, which is you've got AI and Internet of Things and 3D printing and 5G mobile and a whole bunch of technology. Blockchain, although blockchain's had one of those kind of, I think we're in the hype cycle of we're a little bit of trough that maybe we'll hopefully get out of right now.
That's
but
right.
We've had these technologies explode both in terms of growth and adoption, but also their potential to do positive impact on a business. But as you so rightly point in your preface to your book here, we haven't seen the same results in economic productivity either in companies and in this case, and I'm glad you include my Canada in there, we're grouped in the same group of countries where our growth rates are very low single digit. How do we make sense of this paradox?
Well, that's right. If you think of Ray Kurzweil or Ray Diamandis of Singularity University, these guys have put forward this idea of exponential growth, and with that exponential technology, exponential organization. And what they're talking about is that the rate of technological advance is not only increasing, but it's increasing at an accelerating rate. And if you think about that, what that suggests is that we should be in a period of abundance, that we should be getting more and more for less and less. Yep. And then if you look at the economic data we have, whether it's GDP growth or what you're showing here, productivity growth, even as technology is advancing at an accelerating rate, the rate of productivity growth is decelerating. And that is not at all what you would expect. And that's the paradox. So technology is going up, productivity growth is going down. What's up?
Have we answered it? Yeah, have you split the atom here?
So I have kind of a two-part explanation, and you can tell me if it's a satisfactory one. Okay. One part of the explanation is that to do these things, it takes this idea of generation, dissemination, and absorption, and we have the best companies, the Googles, the Microsofts, Amazon, the FANGs, that indeed are doing things and continuing to do things at a really high level. And if we were just looking at their productivity growth, I'm pretty confident we would see continued high performance and maybe even accelerating performance. But most of the organizations are falling further and further behind, and this is called the best versus the rest. And so this is why dissemination and absorption are so important, because productivity growth across an economy is not driven only by the very, very best companies, because they don't employ all that many people, with the partial exception of Amazon. So Google might have 30,000 employees, period. And this is in an economy in the US with 100 million workers. So for us to see overall productivity growth, the rest have to catch up. And artificial intelligence would be a great example of this. There are a few companies that are doing great things with AI right now, but there are vastly many more that haven't even got their data organized in a way where they could even apply AI algorithms and train the algorithms to get new insights on how to improve their business. They're way far away from that. And that's just one example of many where the best are getting further ahead from the rest. So that's, I think, the first one. The second explanation is back to the overall society and this innovation infrastructure. If you ask the question a different way, why was productivity growth so much higher in the 50s, 60s, and 70s than it is now? You start to look at some of the infrastructure investments that we used to make. And in a way, we've been living off of those infrastructure investments that were made decades ago, and we're not keeping up today. And that could be the GI Bill that sent GIs back to college in the 1940s. It could be the National Highway Act that built out the whole highway network in the US in the 50s. It could be NASA and the Apollo program in the 60s that gave rise to not just space and space travel, but insights in communications technologies, the semiconductor industry. All these things grew out of that. And then starting in the mid to late 70s, we started to cut back on all this. And today, although we still spend a lot of money as a government, more and more of the spending is on the safety net for either Social Security or Medicare, and there's not nearly as much being spent on these innovative elements that create the conditions for higher productivity. So those are the two parts to the explanation.
That is an exceptionally interesting historical context. And I could make the argument, I guess, that, China really didn't participate in the innovation economy back in the day. They were a kind of a subsistence kind of economy for a while. But if you look at the parallel to what goes on in China now, they have yet invested in a whole bunch of infrastructure that may be leading them to this industrial 4.0. Who knows, quicker? I think there's some challenges, but there's certainly on that second point, there's a good debate to be had.
Oh, yes. And when we look at AI and the use of data, China is clearly going to give its companies more access to more data sooner than companies in the US will have. And both China and the US will be ahead of Europe. And Europe will have much stronger privacy and data protection, but the companies in Europe are going to be somewhat hamstrung in being able to train up the algorithms in the AI world to compete against the US and China.
Yeah, it is the yin and yang of privacy versus productivity, I think, in a data era, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
I was talking before we jumped on our webcast together that this book that you've just written now, this is your seventh book out of the gate. And I was mentioning this could be one of your most ambitious endeavors, because you're not only trying to have people rely on open innovation from creating great ideas and stuff, but you're looking at it from a full spectrum. But you're also looking, I think you'll tell me differently, not just from a corporate innovation standpoint, but potentially from a national and international policy standpoint in terms of how open innovation works. So talk to me about this three-legged stool that you have, and just am I right on the ambitiousness of what you're trying to do here?
Yes, I think it's insightful that you see that as ambitious, because I also see it that way. And we talked just a moment ago about sort of at the national level, the importance of infrastructure investment that can create a foundation for growing productivity. We didn't really talk yet about how that translates to the firm level. But one of the things that I think may have happened since open innovation came out 17 years ago is that some firms used the language of open innovation to simply shift to outsourcing. And they cut their internal spending on R&D substantially, as well as their other innovative activities. And now they simply buy it through their supply chain, or they acquire it through their business development organization. And in the process, they've hollowed out themselves internally. So from a corporate perspective, they don't have the infrastructure internally in their own company that they used to have. So the companies that used to have big R&D laboratories and have a lot of internal R&D, more and more are shifting away from R toward the D, and as well cutting the overall levels and doing much more buying on the outside. And open innovation is not about outsourcing everything, but I think this is how many companies have used it.
Yeah. I'm intrigued as well. I think innovation generation around open innovation has been a known thing, that we rely on it, at least on the top end of the funnel, to actually get better ideas and to generate a universe. And generally, as a human principle, if you get a group of people looking at something with diverse views, they generally come up with better solutions than somebody that has a narrow and maybe less numerous point of view. You've got innovation, dissemination, and absorption on here, which I think gets not as much credence in either the press or generally with corporate innovation. But I think when it's trying to execute inside a company, those two are very, very important, no?
Yes, and they're particularly important where you want to move past the proof of concept to the point where you actually can generate real business results. Dissemination is important to get many, many more people engaged and on board and contributing to that. And the absorption is really important, particularly around things like training, because companies used to spend a lot of money on training people, particularly during the onboarding process. It was very common for banks, for example, to put people on 6-month rotations across different departments, and then you would pick the one you want. These days, in part due to advances like LinkedIn, companies now want to hire you for the job, and you can prove your qualifications by essentially having already done the job at the previous company. And so the company benefits from less and less training, but it reduces the ability of people to absorb new things. You're only being hired for what you already know, and the company's not investing in helping you learn the new things. So this, I think, can become a barrier as well.
I've often, and one last thing on this whole three triangle thing that you have here, I find oftentimes there's a bit of an organ rejection when it comes to innovation, that you got these smart, bright people that are on the top end of your innovation. They probably are working somewhat separate from the overall company, maybe with tacit understanding from leadership, this is what you're doing. And they, with bright hopes, come to the organization going, we have produced this, go forth and multiply. And all of a sudden they're met with, yeah, we don't know you, and you operate a little bit differently, and you have all these sticky notes on your wall, and yeah, we'll say that we're going to do this, but we're really not. Can you talk to, like, just, you know, this almost impermeable layer between the people that are in charge of change and the people that are in charge of operating your business?
So I think you're absolutely right that these barriers are real, and they're inside many organizations, particularly larger organizations. I would go further and say that once we get through the crisis that we're in right now, and we begin to recover from the crisis, it's going to be a very difficult reckoning for those organizations that are not seen as relevant today to the recovery of the organization. Those budgets and those headcounts are going to get hit, and hit hard. So going forward out of the crisis, we're going to really need to have a tight focus on growth, and we're going to need a way to grow smartly without having to invest huge amount of money to wait for the growth. We need to get what growth we can as soon as we can. And I think this is going to shift a lot of the thinking and behavior in these innovation organizations. And they may get collapsed into the business units, they may be just laid off, but I think what's going to happen is we're going to see a refocusing on a mission of growth and recovery in a way that in previous times, even 5 weeks ago, when the stock market, remember, was at an all-time high. Maybe it was 7 weeks ago, it was an all-time high. And now that seems like many, many years ago.
I had a good friend of mine say that 6 months from now, if you're not in the business of creating shareholder wealth for your CEO, you're not in business. So it's just speaking to your point about growth and recovery. Now, in all of our webcasts, we to pay tribute to the late Robert Lipton, we asked 12 questions of each one of our thought leaders here, and maybe at the end of our first 50 interviews, we'll be able to benchmark how you've answered them. Are you ready for a little bit of a rapid fire game we call?
Sure, I'll try to keep it short.
All right. What's overhyped in your world? What's the thing right now that you're going, that is getting way too much noise and interest?
What's overhyped is the shiny new object, as opposed to the hard work of really getting it out through dissemination and absorption to the whole organization or the whole society, thereby lifting productivity for all of us.
Nice. And you know where my next question's coming. What's underhyped? What's not getting enough attention or appreciation?
Well, that's a good one. One particular one I like is IBM just acquired Red Hat last year for $34 billion. And when I checked, Red Hat had exactly 2 patents. So why did IBM pay $34 billion for a company with basically little or no intellectual property? And the answer, I think, is openness. That IBM is, with this acquisition, is going to move into the so-called hybrid cloud, where it won't matter which cloud you're running on, because you can access and interact with multiple clouds simultaneously. And so I think this is something that's going to become very exciting.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I guess, and IBM, I guess, has some pedigree with its Linux experience, but they've, I guess, taken it in this direction.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Favorite quote?
Not all the smart people work for you, by Bill Joy. Or the other way he says it, most of the smart people work somewhere else.
Very on brand there, Henry. Very on
Yeah,
brand.
sure.
Do you have a to stroke the other side of my brain? Do you have a favorite stat?
Oh, sure. I want to get this right. In 1980, large companies of more than 25,000 people accounted for 70% of all the R&D spending in the United States. Today, they account for about 35% of the
Wow.
R&D spending, and all the growth in R&D spending has been in smaller companies, not the big guys.
Wow. I would ask you to project 30 years from now, but we'd run out of time, and we'd probably run out of brain cells trying to figure that one out. If you were to have a Changemaker Supper and you can invite anybody, it's interesting we're doing this right before Good Friday. Who would you invite to the supper?
Let's see, along with Jesus, who would we have here? I'm not so interested in Judas, actually. He probably has some interesting, he'd be an interesting dinner partner, but I don't think so. Let's see, people that just come to mind. We talked about Blitzscaling. I think Reid Hoffman is a very engaging, inspired guy. Would love to have him. Jeff Bezos, who I think is breaking and in the process formulating new rules on how even very large companies can still innovate. And I think he's got courage, among other things. So he'd be another one I'd love at the table. Bill Gates, I think, is doing so much to mobilize science and technology in intelligent ways for the betterment of the world. So he'd be one I'd love to have there as well. How big a table do I hit?
I don't know, but right now the extraordinarily wealth at your table is incredible. It's maybe a little bit tippy on Gates's and Bezos's end. So.
And I'd probably still get stuck with the check.
Maybe. If you were 23 again, and I'm going to put you in an age bracket that's above 23. So if you were 23 again, knowing what you know now, where would you be spending a lot of time? What would you be doing?
So I have two children, one of whom is 24. So this is not simply an academic exercise.
No.
And she's been studying electrical engineering. And that's not because of my advice. That's just her passion. But I think I would be looking at these data analytics and the ways of using machine learning to identify trends that are otherwise maybe completely invisible, and then developing insights, even in some cases before the people generating the data are themselves aware of it. So that would be an area I would be taking a very close look at if I were 23 today.
Wonderful. And maybe related, but is there a market shift that's blindsided you? You didn't see coming, despite, you obviously live and breathe innovation every day, but there's one thing that you go, wow, did not see that one coming.
One that I'm struck by is, with the exception of Apple, how unsuccessful the mighty and powerful tech companies are in the US when they go to China. And I would have expected there to be much more success there than is being realized.
Interesting. Number of companies that we maybe have all heard of that you have an immense amount of respect or reverence for?
So we mentioned Amazon and how they're able to keep innovating even though they're huge at this point. So that's one that I truly tip my hat to. I just read 2 days ago that Medtronic has opened up its ventilator intellectual property and published the designs and drawings of the ventilator to encourage anybody that wants to try to make ventilators, to greatly expand the supply on very short notice. So Medtronic is a medical device company in Minnesota. I think that's just a really wonderful, impressive, enlightened, and yes, open innovation response to the pandemic we're in now. So they would be another one.
That's, beyond the fact that it's an interesting insight. I find in this current last 2 or 3 months, just a lot of companies showing the best side of themselves, right? So is there a company out there that we might not have heard of that you've been exposed to that you have the same level of admiration for?
So yeah, there's a company in Italy that's an energy utility. I'm here in California where PG&E is in bankruptcy proceedings right now. They've admitted liability for these terrible fires we've been having. So when you think of a utility, you don't think of innovation. But there's an energy company that's a utility in Italy called Enel, Enel, that is surprisingly nimble and agile, environmentally sustainable, launching a new entity called NLX that's trying to become digitally transformed. It's a utility that acts unlike other utilities that I know. So that's another one to take a look at.
Well, we will explore. It's always interesting too. People adding the suffix or prefix X to denote doing something interesting or different. I think that might be a thing now. So,
Yeah.
um, how would you like to be described as a change or impact maker?
So I think one thing that I have put a lot of time into is building a community of people around me to look at these questions, whether it's on the industry side with groups like the Berkeley Innovation Forum. I don't know if we have time to go to your slide there, Sean, on this or
Yeah.
not.
Why don't we do that?
Here we go. Yeah. So in the lower left, this is a group that I started back in 2005. So we're 15 years in right now. And we have 40 companies that come together twice a year and exchange their experience on managing innovation. And this allows me to be the fly on the wall, listening to what everybody's talking about. And of course, I can instigate a few things as well. So it's a great way for me to keep up with a lot of what companies are up to. I also have a center I run at Berkeley, and I have a group of visiting scholars that come in from overseas to spend time there. And I also teach classes there as well. So keeps me up with what young people are doing. And then I've built a community over in Europe called the European Innovation Forum that is also a group of companies there where it's about 20 companies. So I think one thing that I've done as a change maker is I've tried to take people along with me, both from the academic side and the industry side, and I've hopefully tried to build stronger connections between the two sides.
Wonderful. And a little bit on the Berkeley Innovation Forum. I see the dates, April 22nd, 23rd. That's what, 2 weeks from now? How are you dealing with it from we don't have a live forum anymore?
So we were going to Disney Animation in Burbank, California until about 5 weeks ago. And so everybody was very excited about going down to Disney and seeing their Imagineering activities down there. What we're going to do instead is we're going to have 2 shorter days, all online. The first day is going to be the members presenting to each other. The second day is going to be students working on projects for some of the member companies, and they're going to be presenting the results of their projects to the members. So it'll be shorter, will be hopefully interactive as you and I have been now, but it's not going to be the same as being there in person.
I'll be interested in the learning. All right, we have the last 2 questions to close us out here. We're getting to the 9th inning of our interview together. Beyond obviously open innovation, which you spend probably a good lion's share of your time on, what other aspect of innovation or technology are you spending a lot of time with trying to figure out?
So let's see. We talked a little bit about business models and business model innovation as well, particularly in the corporate side. What are the things that make it hard for companies to do that well? What happens when they are able to do it well? And Tendaya Vicky's an example of somebody who's thinking about this as well. So that's something I'm paying attention to. I'm an advisor to the Italian Innovation Fund, which is a new fund of $1 billion to try to stimulate venture capital in Italy. And so that brings in mind a whole lot of things around venturing, around entrepreneurship and innovation, and also this valley of death between research and commercialization, where in Europe, in Italy, and other places, there is some excellent science that's going on, but there's a bit of a valley of death getting it into new companies or into existing companies. And so that's an area that I'm spending time on as well.
And our last question, we know that people are a composite of all the experiences that they bring to the table, some that aren't professional. So what do you do for fun? Oh, we may have a frozen Henry here. Unfortunately, Wi-Fi at the best of times can get in the way. I am going to wait a couple of more seconds and I may have to close out, but I think we had covered most of the discussion that we wanted to cover off. I did want to say to everybody, if Henry doesn't come back, that we will be housing all of our interviews here with our authors in the author studio. And I think Henry's back again. I was mentioning to people Wi-Fi can somehow cut out, and I was doing my little tap dance.
Yeah, I'm back.
I was about to ask you, what do you do for fun outside of this open innovation life you lead?
Yeah, so I do enjoy taking walks, even in our social distancing period. I also ride my bicycle. My family's here with me, and I love them very much. I'm an avid reader, and I enjoy a good bottle of wine.
Californian, or do you go other?
Both. When I'm in Italy, I try to drink Italian or European wine. And when I'm in California, there's great California stuff, but we're fortunate that we get stuff from Chile and South Africa, and New Zealand has got some great not Cabernet, sorry, Sauvignon Blanc. So I enjoy wines from different places.
Not only a great innovator, but a well-heeled wine drinker. Well, I want to thank you very much for this time spent. I think this was very enlightening. I'm very interested now in your new book, as much as I knew you from your first book. I think this one will be interesting, so I'll have to get a read on that. So thank you genuinely for spending time with me today. We're going to post this interview in the author studio. You can look at the URL there in terms of futureproofingnext.com/in the author studio. You can also get us on a number of different social media and podcasting environments, and we'll be hashtagging it as in the author studio. Once again, thank you for community for showing up. Also, Henry, I don't know if you have any final words or advice for people, but I'll leave you with the open stage and close us out.
Well, thank you for the chance to talk about the new book and these crazy times that we're in. The time just flew by, which means I was having a great time, and I hope it was engaging for your audience as well.
Wonderful. All right. Until we meet again in the future, we're saying bye from in the author studio.
Thank you, Sean.